You're just a supply driver, Moritz. Leave the dangerous flying to the real pilots. Those words had followed her for 18 months, whispered and laughed at by men heading to combat while she hauled crates and fuel. But when the call came, Commander Ashton captured in a deadly ambush, every fighter pilot was grounded and only her C-2 Sentinel could reach him. They still smirked as she climbed into the cockpit. Minutes later, she was knifing through a mountain corridor so narrow the wingtips sliced mist from the cliffs. Tracer fire lit the sky as she dropped into the kill zone, yanking 2 men to safety in a move no one thought possible. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. Under the pale wash of afternoon light slanting through the high windows of the operations center, the hum of machinery and muted chatter formed a tense backdrop to what had, until a few minutes ago, been a day of routine updates and flight schedules. Now that hum was shredded by the clipped, urgent voice coming through the comms network. Commander Ashton is captured. All rescue aircraft have been neutralized. The words struck like a hammer blow, heads lifted from screens, officers straightened in their chairs. Somewhere in the corner, an aide's pen clattered to the floor and rolled across the tiles without being picked up. At the heart of the room, an illuminated digital map of the region pulsed with a blinking red marker. Ashton's last confirmed location, buried deep inside hostile territory, where every route in or out was a gauntlet of enemy surveillance and firepower. A senior duty officer's voice cracked slightly as he called out the update. Estimated time until relocation, 6 hours. The map seemed to grow colder under that number, as if the room's oxygen had thinned. Keyboards rattled. Satellite imagery bloomed and flickered on wall screens. Analysts muttered coordinates and signal intercepts to each other, and pilots who'd been waiting on standby scrambled toward hangar bays that would soon be declared off limits. In the farthest corner of the room, Lieutenant Elena Skylark Moritz stood without moving, her hands loosely clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the tactical display. She was in her flight suit, but carried none of the swagger that marked the combat pilots clustered near the front. They had the lean, restless posture of men accustomed to action. She had the stillness of someone who had learned to be overlooked. For a year and a half, she had flown the C-2 Sentinel between carriers and forward bases, hauling cargo, ferrying personnel, delivering what kept operations running but never got the headlines. And for a year and a half, she had heard some version of the same dismissive jab, sometimes said with a grin, sometimes tossed off without looking at her at all. "You're just a supply driver, Moritz." Those barbs had never drawn a visible reaction from her, and in this room, with the crisis hanging over them all, she looked no different, until her gaze shifted from the pulsing red marker to the faces around it. Colonel Ortega was hunched over a data tablet, jaw tight, trying to find an option that didn't exist. Admiral Hughes stood near him, arms folded, eyes on the feed from a reconnaissance drone now circling far from the actual target area to avoid being shot down. The drone's camera showed only empty ridgelines and the occasional glint of movement along the valley roads. Enemy patrols already tightening the net. 2 MH-60 seconds in range, an operations officer offered, but not enough fuel for the depth required even if we refuel mid-route. "By the time we set up a forward base, sir?" His voice trailed off. The math didn't work. The 6-hour clock ticked in everyone's head. They all knew what capture meant in that region. The names of other officers who hadn't made it home hovered unspoken between them. Moritz could feel the shape of a decision forming in the silence. The slow, grim acceptance that Ashton would be left where he was because no one could reach him in time. And in that moment, the voice of her father seemed to echo from another life. "Don't wait to be chosen. Take the stick when it matters. Captain Leonard Spectre Moritz had never raised his voice when training her, but his lessons were edged with steel. Years before she'd worn a uniform, he had taught her to fly under bridges, to skim the earth so low that the shadow of the aircraft merged with the terrain, to read the wind in the shift of clouds against ridges. Those skills had never been part of her official record. They existed between her and the man whose logbooks were still locked away in classified archives. She drew in a measured breath, stepped out from her place against the wall, and spoke toward the table where Hughes and Ortega stood. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting across the layered conversations without rising in volume, "I can get him out." Conversations died mid-sentence. Several officers turned their heads with expressions that ranged from disbelief to irritation, as if they had misheard her. Hughes's eyes narrowed, a faint crease appearing above the bridge of his nose. "Lieutenant Moritz, this is not a milk run to a friendly port," he said evenly. "This is a deep penetration combat extraction." She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, Admiral, I know exactly what it is." Ortega gave a short, humorless laugh. "Lieutenant, we're talking about going into the most heavily defended corridor in the sector. No support, no fallback. One hit, and you're done. This isn't what transport pilots are trained for." The remark wasn't meant to wound, but it was the same cage she had been put in since the day she qualified on the Sentinel. She let it hang for half a second, then asked, "Colonel, may I ask what my father's call sign was?" Ortega glanced down at his tablet, puzzled. "Spectre," he said after a beat. "Captain Leonard Moritz." He looked up. "Why?" She stepped closer to the tactical display, fingers brushing the edge of the console as she addressed them both. "Because Spectre Moritz designed half the penetration routes and evasive profiles your team still train on, and he taught me every one of them." A murmur rippled through the room. The legend of Spectre was known to many here, though the details of his missions were buried so deep that even senior staff only knew fragments. Ortega straightened, his skepticism dented. Hughes's gaze sharpened. "You're saying you can get in there without being detected?" She nodded once. "By using the Phantom Corridor." The name drew blank looks from a few younger officers, but not from Ortega, his brow furrowed. "That's an uncharted ravine system. Too narrow for anything but—" He stopped, the implications settling in. Moritz pointed to the topographic projection, her finger tracing a snaking path through jagged contour lines. "They don't watch it because they think it's impassable. A C-2 Sentinel can make it, but only at sustained low altitude and precision throttle control." She tapped a point just short of the compound. "I get here unseen, deploy Skyhook Delta from overhead. No landing, no warning. We lift him out before they understand what's happening." A silence followed, not the dismissal she had expected, but the weighing of possibility against risk. Someone muttered suicidal, but it no longer had the bite it might have earlier. Hughes's eyes stayed on the route she'd drawn. The drone feed showed nothing that would contradict her claim. The corridor was a blind spot for both sides. Finally he asked, "You understand what happens if you're compromised?" She answered without hesitation. "I carry a full escape and evasion kit. Contingencies included." No one needed it spelled out. They all knew what that meant. Hughes exhaled slowly, then looked at Ortega. The Marine officer gave the barest of nods. "Moritz," Hughes said, "you're cleared to launch." 40 minutes. God help us all. A ripple of movement swept the room as orders went out to ready the Sentinel. Ground crews were already moving toward the hangars. Moritz allowed herself no smile, no outward sign of the surge in her chest. She turned and left the operations center with the same steady stride she'd had walking in, but the air outside seemed sharper, more electric. Somewhere behind her, she could hear voices resuming, this time with her name in them, not as an afterthought, but as the center of the plan. The hangar smelled of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of heat radiating off steel. The C-2 Sentinel sat in the center bay, its nose pointed toward the open tarmac, wings stretching wide under the floodlights that bathed the area in a stark, shadowless glow. Mechanics moved like a pit crew around a race car, bolting on auxiliary fuel tanks, securing countermeasure pods under the wings, feeding cables into the reconfigured cargo bay where the Skyhook Delta rig was being installed. She walked a slow circle around the aircraft, trailing her fingertips along the cool fuselage, feeling each vibration as panels were tightened into place. In the cockpit, she ran through pre-flight checks with the same deliberate care she had used on every supply run, but this time each switch and dial felt like part of a living thing preparing to leap into hostile skies. A junior crewman approached with a tablet for her signature, eyes flicking up to her face as if seeing her differently. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "bring him back." She signed without breaking his gaze. "Count on it." The sky beyond the hangar doors was layered with thickening clouds, the kind that turned the light a bruised gold before the storm broke. Perfect, she thought. It would keep eyes on the ground from scanning the high altitudes while she slipped through the valleys. She climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and pulled the canopy closed, shutting out the bustle of the hangar. In here, it was just her, the hum of the avionics, and the weight of what she was about to attempt. She keyed the intercom to the tower. Sentinel 2-1, ready for immediate departure. Clearance came almost at once. Hughes's voice layered over the controllers. "Bring him home, Lieutenant." She eased the throttles forward, feeling the aircraft begin to roll, the floodlights sliding off the canopy as the nose turned toward the runway. Somewhere out there, through the storm, through the corridor, past the guns and the men who had already written her off, was Ashton. She intended to prove them all wrong before the clock ran out. The Sentinel leapt free of the runway with a predator's certainty, wheels tucking away as Elena eased the nose toward the weather-stained horizon. Thunderheads stacked like fortresses beyond the coast, their undersides bruised and churning, a natural screen that would draw eyes upward while she slipped beneath. She trimmed for low flight, feeling the aircraft settle into her hands, not as machine and pilot, but as a single intention moving through air. The tower's farewell faded in her headset, replaced by the dry hush of wind over fuselage and the distant click of relays as systems armed in sequence. Beneath the canopy, the sea flashed slate and silver between banks of cloud, then surrendered to broken scrub and the first ribs of the mountain chain. She brought the Sentinel down until the altimeter whispered numbers that would make most pilots sweat, and then she took it lower still, where the land itself became cover. Every ridge, every fold of stone was a shield if approached at the right angle, at the right moment, with the right patience. Her father's voice, not as memory but as technique. Flow with the terrain, don't fight it. Use the wind's mood instead of muscling through it. Trust the map in your head more than the numbers on a screen when the screens go blind. She didn't romanticize him anymore. He had been brilliant and difficult, a teacher who demanded precision and offered praise with economy. What remained wasn't the legend that circulated on bases. What remained were patterns, small choices repeated until they were reflex. How to enter a ravine without broadcasting your arrival to every ear. In the valley, how to ride the smoother air under a weather shelf, how to recognize the way rock faces funnel crosswinds and flip an aircraft if you're careless by an inch. Ahead, the land rose in jagged waves, the color washing from coastal greens to iron and ash, snow still clinging in thin smears in shadowed places that never saw full sun. She slid into the foothills, adjusting throttle and pitch, and the Sentinel responded with a deep, steadying hum. A stitch of static crackled, then the operations net returned, voices clipped and disciplined, passing updates with the economy of people who knew that extra words cost time. No one wasted breath telling her to be careful. That instruction, lived inside every decision she made. She nudged the aircraft left to skirt a ridge that would have silhouetted her against brighter sky. Then she chose the darker notch, letting the fuselage blend into the terrain's own gradients. The first narrow pass announced itself not as a visual landmark, but as a change in the way the air touched the wings, tighter, eddying, eager to slap, to shove. She pre-trimmed, forearms loose, the way her father had taught her to avoid overcorrection. When the Sentinel threaded the notch, it did so without drama, a bird slipping between branches. She found the phantom corridor not by coordinates alone, but by the seam where two ranges met and forgot how to fit, leaving behind a twisting gutter of sky, just wide enough for something brave and stubborn to squeeze through. Official maps dismissed the place as unworkable for aviation. Ground patrols treated it like a rumor. That suited her. A pale ribbon of river flung itself along the bottom, white boiling around black stones, and she used that water as a guide. Stay just above the spray where radar returns drown in clutter, where sound ricochets and confuses. She kept the sun mostly behind her so the Sentinel's shape would melt into shadow when ground eyes looked up. She stayed just off-center from the valley floor to prevent her wake from echoing straight back at the walls. This was not just flying, it was a study in angles, in how to borrow invisibility from landscape and weather. The storm met her like a gatekeeper. It had grown wider since takeoff, the leading edge now a ragged curtain that dragged rain across rock in slanting veils. Climbing would have been safer for any other mission. Here, climbing would mean surrendering the only protection she had. She pulled the Sentinel tighter to the valley's line, watching the way gusts bullied the river into scalloped patterns, using that as a forecast of what the next 30 seconds would try to do to her wings. Lightning stitched the cloud beyond the ridge with white threads, the flash blooming for an instant in the cockpit glass. She counted without thinking, not for distance but for rhythm, mapping the storm's breathing. When the first hard drops struck the canopy, they sounded like hand-thrown gravel. Then the sky released a sheet of water that erased the world into a grey rush. She lost the detailed edges of rock and had to read the terrain by the way shadow thickened and thinned, by the taste of the wind as it shifted temperature, by the shift in engine note when the mountain's shape changed the pressure at the inlets. Instruments wobbled but held, the radar altimeter flirted with values that would have given a flight surgeon palpitations. She gave the Sentinel only what was necessary, small inputs, exact throttle to keep wash over the tail, no panic. Turbulence reached in like a rough hand and tried to twist the aircraft off its line. The plane shouldered through, and another fork of lightning burst to the left. There, a glimpse of a darker ridge ahead, its crest broken by a standing rock like a broken tooth. She pivoted on that marker, slipped into a side channel where the rain thinned for a breath, and let the turbulence carry her around instead of forcing a blunt turn. The worst of the squall passed as an edged roar over aluminum, and then grudgingly moved on, leaving the valley rinsed and steaming. A warning tone chirped, not the urgent scream of a lock, but the nag of a system noticing stress. She glanced to the right console and found the culprit. One of the countermeasure pods had taken offense at the turbulence and was shaking just enough to threaten its own mount. She fed a minor yaw input to damp the sympathetic vibration and flagged the pod in her mind as a weak link when things got rough again. Problems in ones and twos were fine. A stack of issues all at once could turn skill into spectacle, followed by epitaph. She made a quiet promise to the aircraft, hold together until she dragged two men out of the fire. Then they could bicker about bolts. The comms net popped with a fragment she was waiting for, thin and dirty, a voice at the edge of intelligibility. "Skylark, if that's you. Don't answer, signal only." It was Vega. the last survivor from Ashton's team. She didn't transmit. Any broadcast from this depth would be a beacon to listening ears. Instead, she toggled the planned response. A brief IR flare visible only to eyes already tuned to look for it, masked from broader detection by the corridor's shape. Seconds later, her threat receiver sniffed at a radar sweep from the wrong direction. The enemy testing their blanket coverage after the storm. Looking for abnormal reflections, she rode the wave's crest and ducked behind heavier rock, letting the return smear in ground clutter. The sweep repeated. She shifted again, one ridge over before the next pass. Patience. Hurry. 2 words that didn't belong together and yet defined this flight. She stole a look at the mental clock she'd been running since Wheels Up, not as numbers but as the color of urgency. Darker now, nearly black. The relocation window for Ashton was closing. Even if they didn't move him, the rhythm of enemy reinforcements suggested that waiting meant facing a hornet's nest when she emerged over the compound. This mission had always been about surprise. Surprise has a half-life. Let it decay, and you're just another target begging to be swatted. She advanced the throttles enough to squeeze a few knots from the engines without climbing. The Sentinel responded with a low growl and began to eat distance faster. The corridor narrowed, then widened without warning into a basin dotted with scrub, a place where walls fell back and sky opened like a trap. She resisted the instinct to breathe easier. Open spaces where you've been tight are places where coverage improves, where eyes can park on you. She angled to keep a line of stunted trees between the Sentinel and a small outpost barely visible on a shoulder of rock to the northeast. No smoke from the hut's chimney, no movement beside the weathered truck half hidden under canvas, but she treated it as if a squad was inside with binoculars and nothing better to do. The nose dipped, skimming back into cover. There was a time, early in her career, when she would have asked permission for each move beyond the ordinary. That person didn't exist anymore. The woman inside this cockpit made decisions on the fly because hesitation kills quiet missions. She slid into the next cleft, wove between 2 pine-clad slopes, and let the river reappear under her left wing. The smell inside the cockpit was warmed metal and an undertone of rain finding its way into places it had no right to be. Drops clung to the canopy's edges and flung themselves into streaks as airflow took them. She remembered a lesson so mundane it would never appear in a manual. Wipe condensation with the back of your glove, not the palm. Palms get oil. Oil smears. Smears become haze when the sun tilts, and then you're blind when a glint is all you have. She smiled without showing any teeth. Spectre had been fussy about the little things because the little things compound. Static crawled again, then Vega's voice returned, shaped by fear disciplined into utility. Courtyard clear for 90 seconds on rotation. IR will mark. Noise discipline compromised soon. He didn't say Ashton's condition. He didn't need to. Moritz answered with silence and a second flare. 2 short, 1 long acknowledgement without words. She pictured the compound as she'd studied it. Rectangular, towers at each corner with heavy weapons, a central open space where a careless pilot might imagine touching down if they were tired of being alive. The perimeter roads were exposed, which made helicopters obvious and slow. The rooftops offered no convenient anchor. Skyhook Delta was a trick you made look simple if you'd spent a lifetime running calculations in your head about drift, swing, and load. Make the pass too fast, and the line snapped taut like a whip. Too slow, and the enemy painted your belly. Make the orbit uneven, and your human cargo banged into masonry until you hauled up a casualty instead of a commander. There was art here, but the art was built on math. She reviewed the drop sequence under her breath, a cadence to bind action to thought, approach steep to stage the deception, flatten not at the lip but a hair beyond, wheels almost kissing empty air to sell the crash. cargo bay ready, line armed, brakes tested for the precise friction needed to keep speed in the window where the retrieval gear behaved, countermeasures on. Hair trigger in case the towers woke fast, exit not straight but curling back toward terrain where eyes and guns lose angles. She considered the misbehaving pod under the wing and built a contingency dodge into her mind's map if it sheared off at the worst possible time. Plan for failure so that success feels inevitable. Wind shifted, cooler, coming down valley now, sliding along the rock like a cat. Updrafts would fray on the cliff faces near the compound, chopping air into pockets. She let the Sentinel taste the change and trimmed to anticipate the bite. The final ridge reared up, and beyond it the world would widen into the basin where the target sat like bait. She nudged power, felt the engine's answer, and kept her hands calm. The sky brightened suddenly as the storm edge fractured and threw pale light across stone. In that strange glow, shadows cut sharper, and distance lied. She trusted edges, not color. The ridge crest slid under, the nose tipped, and the compound revealed itself exactly where her memory had placed it, a bleak geometry of walls and towers, trucks parked in jittery rows, figures moving with the purpose of people accomplishing an ugly job on a deadline. She went high above them first, a clean arc to set up the dive from a place where no one sane would bring a transport. The first shots came not as a surprise but as punctuation, the usual wild greeting from men on the ground who saw a target they didn't expect and had no plan for. Tracers stretched upward in crooked ladders that fell short as she committed to the plunge. The Sentinel's nose came down and gravity took a share of the work. Air roared, the compound swelled. She sensed, rather than saw, that a tower gunner had steadier hands than his peers. She marked that angle and promised herself she would not be in the same line for the second pass if she had to make one. The altimeter spun, the world foreshortened, and at the point where caution would have told her to level, she held a heartbeat longer, letting panic ignite below. Men scattering, weapons slewing, a chaos engine she could ride. Then she pulled, smooth and inexorable, bringing the aircraft flat over the courtyard with a clearance so tight you could have tripped on it. The cargo bay yawned. The Skyhook Delta spilled its steel lifeline into the square. From her peripheral vision she caught the wink of infrared in dust, Vega's mark exactly where planned. She held the Sentinel in that narrow envelope where lift, drag, and weight argued but didn't quarrel, and the extraction line shivered as if tasting prey. Bullets found metal, sharp, mean knocks somewhere aft, and the misbehaving pod shuddered in complaint. She bled a hair of speed to keep the line gentle enough not to break someone's ribs, then added a sliver of throttle to prevent sink. The balance was a coin on edge, and she kept it upright with fingertips. A heavier thump told her someone down there had found a larger gun. She jinked a fraction, not enough to ruin the geometry, just enough to toss off aim. There, movement at the base of the line, two shadows merging, a brief flurry as the harness locked. The cable drew a clean diagonal in the dusty light. She allowed herself a single breath and began the exit turn, not away into open air, where every weapon could draw a bead, but back toward the darker slope, where the valley would again become her ally. The line went taut, the retrieval rig complained in its own language, and the Sentinel answered with a small shiver through the frame as it accepted the additional burden. Someone on a tower panicked and sent a spray of rounds across the path where she had been a heartbeat earlier. A smarter shooter waited, guessed her second position, and nearly guessed right. Rounds walked toward her canopy like footsteps. She slid the nose a whisper, and those footsteps lost the trail. The threat receiver finally woke properly, not from the compound but from a site farther out that had found the guts to illuminate her. She didn't bother with the full countermeasure program. She threw chaff like confetti while hugging the terrain so tight the debris had nowhere to go but down with her, a trailing haze to baffle the picture. The damaged pod complained again, louder this time, rattling at a frequency that told her the mounting bracket was loosening. She pictured it tearing free and mapped the path it would carve if that happened, and she adjusted the bank a human hair so that path wouldn't intersect the cable if worst came to worst. Vega's voice burst in her ear, strangled with strain and relief all at once. He didn't waste syllables on thanks. He told her exactly how much play they had on the line before swing became a problem. She tightened her arc and felt the load settle into a smoother pull, as if the line had learned her rhythm and agreed to dance to it. The compound fell behind, the basin opened, and the Sentinel dove back toward the jagged safety of the corridor. Only then did she allow the smallest fraction of the tension wired through her shoulders to ease. The mission was not complete. Survival demanded that she cross the same knife's edge in reverse, and the clock had its own cruel arithmetic. But the first impossible part was now a fact. She skimmed the first ridge on egress and immediately throttled back, not to slow but to stay under the acoustic profile that would make her easier to triangulate. Less noise in the wrong places meant more life later. The sky dimmed again as the storm's tatters dragged their grey lace across the valley mouth. Good. Concealment often arrived wearing a miserable coat. She took what she was given. The corridor embraced her as an accomplice, and she fed the aircraft into its throat with a confidence that came from earned knowledge, not stubbornness. Behind, angry men shouted into radios and pointed at empty air. Ahead, the river flung itself onward with indifference to human drama. She matched that indifference with focus. Her hands were steady, her jaw unclenched a millimeter. The Sentinel carried 2 lives on a line and a reputation inside its skin. The way out would demand every trick she'd ever learned, and 1 or 2 she would have to invent on the fly. She held the Sentinel on the knife edge of the corridor, and as the valley's granite walls slid past like dark water, her mind returned, not as a distraction, but as a checklist replaying itself with surgical clarity, to the moment the mission shifted from rumor to order. The green light hadn't arrived with fanfare. Admiral Hughes simply looked up from the map, weighed the cost he was sanctioning, and said the words that turned an idea into duty. The air in the ops center had tasted different after that, ionized by decision. On the walk to the hangar, she could feel the base changing around her, mechanics breaking into a run, a cart squealing under the weight of pods and brackets, a munitions tech palming a wrench like a relay baton. The aircraft waited with its nose pointed toward day's last light, and the crew chief intercepted her with a crisp rundown that sounded like a countdown. Extra tanks arriving from the parts cage, countermeasure housings coming off for inspections, the cargo bay half stripped as the Skyhook drum and guide rollers were craned into place. She signed for the rig with a grease-stained stylus that left a black crescent on her glove, and crouched by the bay threshold to watch the install. The retrieval drum looked like a piece of ship machinery grafted into an airplane, dense and purposeful, its tolerances tight enough to sing when you spun it with a fingertip. They would not spin it today. They would trust it to pay out clean under load, and then take up slack like a patient fisherman lifting a prize from a boiling river. She asked for cable swap kits to be stowed within reach, not because she planned to re-rig mid-flight, but because having options changed the way a mind approached pressure. You flew better when you hadn't painted yourself into a corner before leaving the ground. The loadmaster, a woman whose hair was buzzed short enough to hide under the rim of her headset, checked each guide eyelet with a flashlight and a nail, feeling for the burr that would turn steel into a saw in the worst second of a mission. Nothing caught. Good. They bolted down a reinforced deck plate to spread the stress of the line across structure designed for crates and pallets, not human lives dangling in hot air. While they worked, she ran her own rituals. not superstition. Habits that had outlived the man who taught them because they worked. She cleaned the canopy edges with a square of cotton. Until her reflection came back sharp, she tested the throttle detents against her palm until she could find each notch blindfolded. She dialed the radios and then covered them with her hand, listening not to volume but to timbre, looking for the faint wrong hiss that meant a solder joint was lying to you. The crew chief announced the countermeasure pods fitted, flare and chaff cartridges topped. She walked the wing's undersides and put her weight through each mount with the heel of her hand. If anyone found it odd to see a pilot thumping hardware, they said nothing. Authority flows from competence, and everyone could smell that the usual chain of machismo had been cut and re-welded around the person who would carry this risk. She asked for the spare mounting bolts anyway and had them taped under a panel where she could reach them with a multi-tool, an act most would mock as paranoia were it not for the weather boiling over the range and the mission's quiet rules. Then came the maps, not the official top sheets that everyone in the building could recite, but the laminated fragments she had made for herself, tiles of terrain with hand-drawn arrows showing the way wind pools in bowls and accelerates at saddles, with notes in pencil, rotor scrub risk here, thermal sink after storm front, dust devils on warm days. She laid them out on a maintenance cart and talked Ortega through the route like a guide telling a climber where the rock changes from limestone to shale. He watched her finger trace ridgelines and toggled between skepticism and reluctant admission that a person who sees the landscape like this isn't just talking brave. He asked about the return leg, and she pointed to the long line of the corridor's spine. Fast as she'll give, hug the dark side, 3 search nodes to beat before they can spool up their picture. He started to suggest a racetrack orbit for helicopters to meet her outbound if she made it, and she shook her head. The entire point was to remove rhythm from the enemy's expectations. They would ride the unexpected all the way home, or they wouldn't ride at all. Hughes stopped at the edge of the cart, scanned her notes, and didn't try to edit them. He only said, "If you hear full illumination, drop ballast and disappear. I can't lose you and Ashton both." She didn't answer immediately because he'd used her first name earlier, and now he hadn't. Command distances itself when it must. She nodded once and went back to the aircraft. The checklist came alive under her hands. Electrical, fuel, hydraulics. She refused autopilot initialization. If the storm punched her hard, any automation would fight her, and she didn't bring rivals into the cockpit when seconds mattered. She set the retrieval brake friction to a number that existed only between her fingertips and the memory of the drum's weight. The loadmaster strapped into a jump seat and repeated the cable's status with the solemnity of a vow. The crew chief blew into his cupped hands and then slapped the fuselage twice as if waking an animal. "I'll be here when you land," he said, as if it were a fact, not a hope. Up in the ops room, she had recognized contempt dressed as humor. Out here, she found the quieter loyalty of people who never get the speech but do the work that makes the speech worth delivering. She keyed the interphone and requested a quick systems stress test. Flaps, spoilers, the full sequence of movements that teach everything to behave in harmony. The Sentinel flexed and settled. No complaints. She took that as consent. In her pocket, the small laminated card that her father had once given her sat like a talisman. It wasn't a quote or a prayer, it was a list of 5 lines in pencil, smudged, that looked like nothing unless you knew. 1. Don't show up where they're already looking. 2. Throttle cures fear but causes sins. Measure it. 3. Let topography hide you, don't ask avionics to. 4. A good exit plan alters the risk of entry. 5. Speak softly to machines, they hear tone. She had laughed as a teenager when he wrote that last one. She no longer laughed. On the ramp, 2 crew hauled a slender crate toward the cargo bay. Inside lay the spare harness assemblies, repacked to her liking. She had asked that one be rigged with a redundant tether, unlikely to be used, but the comfort of a second line can change a man's mind about grabbing salvation when mortars are walking closer. The loadmaster threaded the lines and called her over to inspect. She didn't trust signatures alone. She wanted the feel of the webbing in her own hands and the confidence that comes with recognizing the scent of fresh nylon and machine oil when it's about to become a human being's last hope. The base weather officer trotted up, tablet under his arm, offering storm movement plots and gust projections. He kept glancing at her face, as if hunting for a tell that might show panic. He found none. Not because she was numb, but because calculation keeps fear at bay. Fear hates math. The plots told her what she needed. The front would shear along the range in slanted bands, leaving windows if you knew where to wait, and holes where lightning would briefly make daytime through soup. She thanked him without ceremony, and he looked almost startled, as if manners were the strangest thing he'd seen all day. She used the last minutes before rollout to brief the tiny circle that needed to know exactly how she'd call for the mark. She refused voice if she could help it. She preferred optics, the flicker of IR that people without a reason to watch would ignore, while those with the need would recognize like a handshake. She and the comms tech agreed on a backup protocol barely more complex than a blink, a way to say shift the mark 10 meters or hold all beacons without drawing attention from wider sensors. When she finally climbed the ladder and swung into the seat, she paused before pulling the canopy down. The hangar's light framed the world in crisp edges. Outside, the tarmac swallowed footsteps and amplified engine coughs from other bays. She looked once at the crew chief, once at the loadmaster, and once at the rectangle of sky ahead. Then she sealed herself in and let the cockpit turn those sounds into filtered vibration. Taxi was short, takeoff shorter. She used more runway than strictly necessary, not because she doubted the engines, but because she wanted the climb to seem lazy to eyes that might be watching through poor optics from the hills. Anger shoots, suspicion reports. She wanted neither until she chose to be loud. Even now, with the corridor pressing in and the retrieval line swaying behind like a tether to mortality, the memory of that preparatory hour fed every micro-decision. The loose countermeasure mount that had begun to chatter under turbulence. She had already sketched its failure path and placed a wrench where she could reach it if a panel blew and a bracket swung. The drum's friction set to a hair higher than standard because the valley's winds tend to gust and surge, and a too-free line behaves like a serpent. "The spare harness?" A comfort in Vega's voice when he clipped Ashton in, because he could feel resilience in his hands and matched her calm with his own. The mantra that her father had pressed into her, never arrive in the obvious way, never leave in a line they can finish with a ruler, had become a flight plan that even the storm could not bully into simplicity. On egress now, the corridor's spine guiding her toward friendlier air, she thanked the earlier version of herself who refused to let speed erode diligence. A mission like this isn't won in the minute of spectacle. It's purchased bolt by bolt, choice by choice, in a bay that smells of fuel and human focus. Hughes's face would have been unreadable as she rolled. Ortega's quip about supply pilots belonged to another hour. The men who had smirked outside the crew room had already been replaced in her mind by the mechanic who tightened a mount until his knuckles bled, and the loadmaster who checked a cable eyelet with a fingernail and a scowl. That invisible chorus was with her now, in the way the Sentinel felt like an animal content to be ridden hard by someone who had earned its respect. The retrieval system hummed within its housing, bearing weight with a patience that felt almost moral. The wing pod kept its complaining to a sulky tremor. If it chose to fall off, it would do so where she had space to let it go and not tear the cable. The storm tugged at the air again, and she let the tug become part of her line. The phantom corridor's walls swam past as if bending to help. The egress nodes that enemy radar would bring online, 3 of them, were ahead, and she had no intention of giving them a stable target. The plan from the cart in the hangar was about to turn from pencil to motion, run the long axis of the ravine at near maximum throttle, burst past each node before their picture sharpened, and trade a small measure of structural kindness for survival. She whispered to the throttle, not because the machine could hear language, but because tone changes hands. She softened her grip as she advanced power, and the engines answered with the kind of eagerness that made belief unnecessary. Behind her, the line stayed clean, and the men at the end of it stopped being fugitives and became cargo the way hope becomes a thing you can carry. All of this, the fast approvals, the wrenching, the quiet vows near a drum of cable, had carved a path through the hours to this stretch of sky. Preparation had not guaranteed success. It had merely manufactured enough luck to give skill a chance. Now she would cash it in. Under the fading light, the mountains ahead sharpened into a jagged silhouette, each ridge a darker shade against the bronze glow of the late afternoon. Elena eased the C-2 Sentinel lower, letting the aircraft's shadow merge with the terrain until it was swallowed by the deep folds of the phantom corridor. Every muscle in her arms read the air, gusts whispering through the control yoke, subtle shifts in resistance that warned of crosswinds gathering on the leeward side. The storm she'd punched through earlier was breaking apart over the far ridges, spilling ribbons of rain that glimmered briefly before dissolving into mist. She welcomed the obscuration. The enemy's optics would hate this light. The retrieval drum behind her hummed under the strain of Ashton and Vega's combined weight. It was a steady, living sound, reminding her with every note that she was flying not just metal and systems, but 2 lives tethered by steel cable. She glanced at the tension gauge, saw it sitting exactly where it needed to be, and shifted her focus back to the terrain. The first of the radar nodes was coming up fast, perched on a bare shoulder of rock to the east, its mast barely visible in the haze. She'd studied its sweep pattern for weeks in the ops archive. It was predictable but merciless if you wandered into its blind arcs at the wrong moment. She timed her run, angling the Sentinel into the corridor's deepest cut, so the next sweep would be blocked by solid mountain before it could paint her. The aircraft surged forward, engines straining just under maximum to preserve a margin for the next sprint. The second node was trickier, built on a ridge where the valley widened just enough to give radar a clean look. She didn't intend to give it that look. Banking left, she threaded between 2 spurs of stone so tight she could feel the turbulence curl around them and slap the tail. The Sentinel shuddered once, then leveled clean. Her threat receiver stayed silent. No lock, no spike. Good. She could almost hear her father's dry chuckle in her head. They can't hit what they don't know is there. Rain began again, this time as a fine mist that clung to the canopy and refracted the last scraps of sunlight into a halo. Visibility dropped to a handful of 100 meters, but in the corridor, that was enough. The final node sat just beyond a kink in the valley, the mast hidden until you were nearly on top of it. Elena flattened her approach, keeping low and fast, waiting for the terrain's natural rise to hide her from its gaze. At the last moment she slid the Sentinel into the curve, let the slope mask her completely, and burst through the node's coverage before the system's operators even knew they'd had company. Only open ground lay ahead now, friendlier airspace just minutes away. But she didn't let herself relax. She'd seen too many flights falter at the finish line, lulled by the idea that the worst was over. A new threat could appear at any time, a stray patrol with the man-pads, a lucky gunner on a hill. She kept her eyes moving, scanning every ridge and shadow. Behind her, the retrieval line remained taut, no swing, no dangerous oscillations. Ashton's voice crackled faintly in her headset, rough but steady. "Skylark, remind me never to doubt you again." She allowed the smallest smile. "Copy that, Commander. Hold tight, we're almost home." The valley began to open into the lowlands near Allied territory. The smell of wet earth drifted into the cockpit through the ventilation system, a reminder of just how close the ground was under her. She banked gently to follow the river's last bends, keeping the Sentinel's belly shielded from any curious eyes that might still be out here. Then, with one final push of throttle, she cleared the last ridge. Friendly IFF signals bloomed on her scope like a promise kept. She didn't need the tower's voice to know they'd been tracking her. Relief was a language spoken in the silence after too many minutes of tension. Still, it was good to hear the words, "Skylark, you're in the green. Welcome back." She exhaled slowly, then began the careful process of winching the retrieval line in, the cable spooling back into the belly of the Sentinel with mechanical precision. Each rotation of the drum was a step closer to solid ground, to ending this impossible run with everyone still breathing. Only when Ashton and Vega were secure in the cargo bay did she allow herself to ease the Sentinel's speed and climb toward the approach path. The corridor lay behind her, but its shadow lingered in her blood, a reminder of what it had taken to pass through unseen. Ahead, the runway stretched like an open hand, and for the first time since she'd left it, she let herself believe they'd all walk away from this. The runway lights of Nas Clearwater burned through the damp evening haze, straight lines of amber guiding Elena in from the edge of hostile airspace. She kept the Sentinel steady, feeling the subtle shifts in weight distribution as the retrieval system locked Ashton and Vega into place in the cargo bay. The engines purred at a disciplined throttle setting, enough to keep her on profile without telegraphing strain to the crew in back. Each passing mile felt like the final stretch of a long, punishing climb, the summit visible but still demanding every ounce of focus. She touched down without flourish, main gear kissing the tarmac in a measured, balanced landing. Reverse thrust engaged cleanly, the sound rising in the cabin like a controlled growl, and the Sentinel rolled to a purposeful deceleration. Ground crews surged forward even before the aircraft came to a complete stop. She brought the throttles to idle, feathered the props, and sat for half a beat, letting the moment settle before powering down. The canopy lifted, spilling in the night air tinged with jet exhaust and the tang of wet asphalt. The cargo ramp lowered with a hydraulic sigh, revealing Ashton still in the harness. Vega braced beside him, both men worn to the bone but upright. Their boots hit the deck, and medics moved in immediately, headlamps bobbing as they began assessments. Ashton looked up at her, his face drawn but his eyes sharp. "Moritz," he said, voice gravel from dehydration. "That was the most disciplined flying I've ever seen. No theatrics, no bravado, just a soldier recognizing another's craft." Admiral Hughes approached from the cluster of senior staff, forming near the edge of the ramp. His gaze swept over the aircraft, then settled on her. "You executed a mission we couldn't have ordered anyone else to attempt. You brought them back when every other option was hours too late." She felt the weight of the words. The difference between what they thought she could do this morning and what they knew now. Ashton, still half supported by a medic, leaned toward her. "If you ever need a seat on my bird, you've got it." It wasn't just camaraderie, it was the kind of promise made in places where survival is negotiated in seconds. She answered with a nod, knowing it would mean more than a speech. The Sentinel, now silent behind her, smelled faintly of rain and burnt propellant. She walked the length of its fuselage, brushing fingertips against the skin as ground crews began post-flight inspections. Each rivet and seam had done its job, holding together through punishment that would be dissected later in maintenance reports. The misbehaving countermeasure pod still clung stubbornly to its mount. She patted it once in silent acknowledgement before stepping off the ramp. Inside the ready room, Ortega waited with the route projection still frozen on a monitor. He traced the phantom corridor with a forefinger, then looked at her. "You threaded that needle better than I thought possible." No apology for his earlier skepticism, but the respect in his tone was a shift just as tangible. She unzipped her flight suit halfway, the warm air inside mixing with the chill that had clung to her since the mountains. "The corridor works," she said simply. "You just have to listen to it." Hughes entered, holding a folder that wasn't standard debrief paperwork. "We'll get to the after-action review tomorrow," he told her, "but there's something you should see now." He laid the folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal assignment orders stamped with the highest classification. The header read, "Advanced Tactical Aviation Program, Immediate Transfer." She scanned the page, the lines of deployment destinations and mission profiles unlike anything she'd been allowed to touch before. "This is permanent?" she asked, more to confirm the scope than out of doubt. Hughes gave a short nod. "Your work today proved you're not just capable, you're essential. We need that kind of unconventional thinking shaping our next generation of pilots." The words landed with the same clarity as her father's lessons had years ago. Quiet, direct, and unshakable. She closed the folder, the paper cool under her hands. Outside, the Sentinel sat under floodlights, its shadow stretching long over the tarmac. It would be turned over to maintenance soon, stripped down and built back up for its next mission. But tonight, it had already done something few thought it could, carried a pilot into the heart of danger and brought her and her passengers back intact. As she stepped outside, the breeze carried the faintest scent of salt from the distant sea. Ashton was seated on a stretcher nearby, IV line in place, but he caught her eye and lifted a hand in a small salute. She returned it without breaking stride, the moment brief but weighted. In the background, the sound of tools on metal echoed off hangar walls, a reminder that missions begin again, even before the last one feels finished. She didn't know yet what the Advanced Tactical Aviation Program would demand of her, but the Phantom Corridor had taught her something she would carry forward. The path no one expects is often the only one worth taking. The briefing room was quiet now, stripped of the urgency that had crackled through it only hours before. Outside its windows, the airfield shimmered under floodlights, the Sentinel's silhouette still parked on the apron like a shadow that refused to move on. Elena sat across from Admiral Hughes, a cup of untouched coffee cooling between her hands. The after-action debrief had been thorough, technical, and in places brutally candid, but it hadn't felt like an interrogation. Instead, it was as if the entire command was trying to recalibrate its understanding of what she could do. The data feeds from her flight, terrain masking arcs, radar evasion records, and the precision of the Skyhook Delta pickup were already being archived as training material. Hughes broke the silence first. "The retrieval footage will be studied for years," he said, not as flattery but as a fact. "They'll teach it to crews who think certain airframes are limited to certain jobs." She set the coffee down, leaning forward slightly. It worked because no one believed it would. The corridor, the angle, even the weather, it all played into the surprise. Hughes nodded slowly. "That element won't last forever. But your ability to read the conditions and adapt them into a plan, that's what I'm moving you for." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. The words Advanced Tactical Aviation Program were printed in bold above her name. "You start in 2 weeks. Top cover missions, unconventional exfil, prototype testing. You'll have resources we can't give you here." She let the envelope rest under her fingertips, its weight far more than paper. "What about the Sentinel?" she asked. Hughes smiled faintly. "She'll be reassigned, but I have a feeling you'll see her again." There was a beat. Then he added, "And Moritz, don't expect anonymity anymore. You just rewrote a few lines in the playbook." When she left the building, the night air was cooler, tinged with the metallic scent of recent rain. Across the tarmac, Ashton was leaning on a crutch, still in fatigues that looked as though they'd been through a furnace. Vega stood beside him, an IV line taped to his forearm, both men talking quietly until they noticed her approach. Ashton's grin was lopsided but genuine. "I owe you a drink," he said. "Something stronger than whatever they've got in the med bay." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." Vega disagreed. "We both do. You came in when everyone else was talking about waiting. That's not something you forget." They talked briefly about the mission, what the compound looked like from the ground, the confusion in the courtyard when the Sentinel's shadows swept over them. Ashton's voice turned thoughtful. "When you dropped in, half of them thought you were crashing. The other half didn't know what to think. That's why it worked." She filed that away. Sometimes the most effective tactic wasn't just skill, but the ability to let the enemy misinterpret what they were seeing. Later, back in her quarters, the envelope lay on her desk, still unopened. She'd read it, of course, but now it was the physical reminder of a path she hadn't been on yesterday. Above it hung a small framed photograph, her father in flight gear, squinting into bright sunlight, a younger version of herself barely visible at the edge of the frame. She thought of the lessons, half lecture, half dare, that had brought her here. Don't fly the mission they expect. Fly the mission you've decided they'll never see coming. The base quieted as night pushed on, but the hangars stayed lit, crews working on aircraft that would leave before dawn. Through her window, she could see the Sentinel's profile against the lights, ground crew moving around her like caretakers around a prizefighter between bouts. Elena knew the airframe would be stripped, inspected, and logged before being sent to its next assignment. She also knew that no amount of paperwork would capture the way it had moved through the corridor, or how it had held steady with two men hanging on a cable while hostile guns tried to cut the sky out from under them. That belonged to her alone. Before she turned in, she stepped outside once more, walking the length of the tarmac until she reached the aircraft. The maintenance chief looked up from his clipboard, nodded, and stepped aside. She rested a hand on the fuselage, feeling the faint warmth still lingering in the metal. "Good work," she murmured, too quietly for anyone else to hear. In that moment, it wasn't about orders, programs, or recognition. It was about knowing that when the chance came, she hadn't hesitated, and the machine under her had risen to meet the challenge. As she walked back toward the barracks, the envelope still waiting on her desk, she knew the next mission would come. Different in shape but cut from the same cloth. And when it did, she'd carry with her the knowledge that the best rescues aren't always flown by the pilots everyone expects. They're flown by the ones ready to take the stick when no one else will. 2 weeks later, the landscape of Elena's world had shifted entirely. The familiar rhythm of NAS Clearwater, the morning briefings, the predictable cargo runs, the quiet nods from ground crew, was replaced by the pace of a program that didn't advertise its existence. The Advanced Tactical Aviation Program operated out of a remote facility tucked between high desert ridges, where the horizon stretched in every direction, but the air was thick with secrets. From the moment she arrived, the tempo was relentless. Instructors who'd flown everything from stealth prototypes to black-budget transports dissected her Phantom Corridor mission frame by frame. They asked not just what she had done, but why she had made each decision, pressing her to articulate instincts honed in silence over years of milk runs. The aircraft here were a mix of familiar and alien, modified airframes with skins that shimmered at certain angles, cargo bays reimagined for roles the designers never put in brochures. Her assigned trainer, Commander Royce Hale, was a wiry man with a voice like gravel and a gaze that missed nothing. "You're not here to repeat what you did," he told her on the first day. You're here to learn how to make the impossible routine. Simulations were punishing. They'd drop her into digital valleys modeled on real-world topography, throw in weather patterns that shifted without warning, then insert rescue targets under fire. If she took a textbook approach, the scenario would end in a simulated crash or capture. If she improvised, every move was logged for review, every success and failure replayed until she could explain it backward and forward. Hale pushed her hardest on extraction profiles. Anyone can fly in, he said. Getting out with a live package under hostile pressure, that's the art. During one session, they recreated the Phantom corridor. Only this time they placed radar nets in unexpected spots, mimicking an enemy that had studied her tactics. She adapted by altering her altitude changes, masking her heat signature with a planned dive through a thermal inversion layer. The simulation ended with the target extracted and her airframe untouched. Hale's only comment was a slow nod. Now you're thinking like they don't know you're coming. Evenings were spent in the hangars, learning the guts of the aircraft she'd be flying. Engineers walked her through systems that allowed for mid-flight reconfiguration, cargo bays that could shift to medical evac setups in minutes, extraction winches that could handle double the standard load, countermeasure systems that could spoof not just radar but acoustic sensors. She made a point of memorizing the manual override procedures for each, because electronics failed and missions didn't pause for reboot cycles. One night she found herself alone with a matte grey prototype that looked like a cross between a Sentinel and a stealth transport. Its skin seemed to drink in the light. A placard on its nose read Aurora's Ghost. Hale caught her studying it. "That's your next bird," he said. "She can do what the Sentinel did for you, only quieter, faster and deeper." When she wasn't flying or wrenching, she was in briefings about extraction targets that had never made the news. Diplomats caught in sudden coups, intelligence assets compromised in city centers, special operations units pinned down in places no official map admitted existed. The through line in all of them was the same: no time for a conventional rescue, no margin for error. That, she realized, was the essence of the program, preparing for the calls no one else could answer in time. Word of her corridor run had followed her here, but it wasn't a banner she wore. If anything, the scrutiny made her sharper. In the quiet moments between drills, she thought of her father, not in nostalgia, but as a bar set both high and personal. He had flown missions that still lived in whispers. She intended to build her own ledger of ghosts and victories. One afternoon, midway through a simulated mountain exfil, an alert pinged her comms, real-world tasking. Immediate prep. She followed Hale to the operations room, where a wall-sized display showed a live feed from a coastal region half a world away. A friendly reconnaissance team had been compromised inland, their escape route blocked by sudden militia activity. Conventional rotorcraft couldn't reach them without crossing into active air defense zones. The room quieted as eyes turned to her. Hale didn't make it a question. "You've got the profile for this. We launch in 4 hours." It would be her first live mission with the program. The first test of whether her corridor rescue had been a singular stroke of luck or the beginning of a repeatable skill set. As she studied the map, tracing the valleys and ridges between the stranded team and the coast, she felt the familiar shift inside, nerves sharpening into calculation, possibilities narrowing into a line only she could see. The planning moved quickly. They'd use Aurora's Ghost, its reduced signature allowing her to slip through gaps in the radar mesh. Extraction would be via a dual-line Skyhook variant to lift both personnel and sensitive equipment in one pass. The weather over the target zone promised fog and crosswinds, complications for anyone else, but for her, elements to weave into the plan. Hours later, as she strapped in, she caught her reflection in the canopy glass. The base lights painted her helmet in alternating bands of shadow and glare. Somewhere out there, a team was counting down the minutes, hoping someone was coming. She flexed her gloved hands on the controls, feeling the machine wake under her. The voice in her headset was calm, professional. Ghost, you are cleared for departure. She smiled faintly at the call sign. This was the work now. The jobs no one else could take, flown on the edge of sight where the best rescues came from the sky. Aurora's ghost skimmed the edge of dawn, the horizon ahead a pale line between night and day. Elena kept the aircraft low, her eyes moving from the navigation display to the living map of ridges and valleys outside the canopy. The coastal air carried a damp chill, and the ground fog rolled like slow rivers through the lowlands, exactly the cover she had hoped for. Her mind moved through the route like a pianist through familiar keys, every change in pitch and bank tied to a corresponding fold in the earth. The comms stayed quiet except for occasional updates from the forward observer embedded with the reconnaissance team. Militia patrols had pulled back momentarily, but their position suggested the window would close in less than 10 minutes. She brought Aurora's ghost into the final valley before the target zone, throttling back to let the fog swallow them entirely. The aircraft's skin seemed to dissolve into the mist, radar return almost non-existent. She picked her moment and pitched upward slightly, letting the nose rise just enough to clear the tree line before the compound came into view, an unfinished coastal outpost repurposed into a barricade. 4 figures crouched inside the perimeter, their silhouettes jagged against the pale ground. A 5th shape was the equipment case, too sensitive to abandon. There was no time for theatrics. She brought the ghost into a tight descending arc, the belly hatch opening with hydraulic precision. The dual skyhook lines uncoiled into the fog like threads, their guide weights dropping exactly where she wanted them, in the open space between the team and the outer fence. On her signal, the men moved. She felt each clip on through the vibration in the cable, a silent confirmation that the package was secure. Gunfire erupted from the far side of the compound, muffled by the fog but no less lethal. She didn't wait to see if the shooters had a clear line. Power came up smoothly under her hands, and the ghost began to climb, the lines taut but stable, lifting the team clear of the perimeter. The aircraft banked hard toward the coast. The angle chosen to put the nearest ridge between them and the militia's firing arc before they could adjust. The fog worked both ways, concealing her from view but hiding potential threats as well. Twice she saw the ghostly shapes of trucks on dirt tracks below, headlights cutting through the grey in erratic beams. Each time she adjusted course by degrees rather than broad swings, keeping the ghost's movement minimal and almost organic, as if the mist itself was guiding them. The tension in the lines behind her remained steady, no dangerous swing, no sudden slack. Within minutes, the lowlands gave way to the coast. The water lay flat and colorless under the early light, the horizon blurred by the meeting of fog and sea. Her navigation display showed the friendly marker waiting 20 nautical miles offshore, a ship with a flight deck cleared for immediate reception. She descended again, using the sea's surface to further blend their profile into the environment. The last stretch was the easiest, but she treated it as if it were the most dangerous. Fatigue was a predator here, tempting a pilot to ease off when precision mattered most. She brought the ghost alongside the ship with a pass so smooth the deck crew later swore they hadn't heard her approach until the lines were already swinging the team down. The moment the last man's boots hit the deck, she retracted the skyhooks, sealed the hatch, and pulled the aircraft into a wide arc over the open water. The radio crackled to life with a voice from the ship. Package received. All secure. Outstanding work, Ghost. She keyed the mic. Copy that. Returning to base. There was satisfaction in her voice, but also the same calm she'd carried through every moment of the flight. Emotion could wait. Procedure came first. Back at the desert facility, the debrief was brief. Successes noted, minor variables discussed, and then dismissed until the full review. Hale met her on the ramp as she climbed down from the cockpit. He didn't offer a handshake, just a nod and the words, "You made that look easy." She knew it wasn't, and so did he, but she accepted the compliment for what it was, a marker of trust earned. That evening she walked the length of the hangar where Aurora's ghost was being serviced. The aircraft's skin caught the last light and swallowed it, as if even the sun couldn't pin it down. She ran a hand along the curve of the nose, feeling the hum of cooling systems within. This was a different machine than the Sentinel, but the bond felt the same, a shared knowledge that they'd been to a place where failure wasn't an option. On her desk in quarters, the envelope from Hughes was joined by a smaller one, orders for her next assignment already sealed. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat with the quiet, letting the weight of 2 missions, one in the mountains, one in the fog, settle into memory. She thought again of her father's 5 rules and realized she'd lived all of them without consciously checking the list. When she finally opened the orders, the location was redacted, the details minimal, but she didn't need a map to know the shape of it. Somewhere there was a problem no one else could solve in time. Somewhere the pilot nobody expected was already on the roster. Some missions are written into history, others live only in the memories of the few who were there, carried like a quiet fire. Elena Skylark Moritz had flown twice now, into places no one was supposed to reach, and twice she'd returned with lives that would have been lost without her. She didn't do it for medals or recognition. She did it because she'd spent her whole life preparing for the call no one else could answer. Maybe you've been underestimated, told you're only suited for the routine, only to prove everyone wrong when it mattered most. If you've ever been that person, or you know someone who has, share this story. This is Veteran Biker. Thank you for riding with us. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below to tell us what you thought, and check out the other videos appearing on your screen now. The next mission is always closer than you think.